Happiness through curiosity on the Ranveer Show. Welcome to TRS Clips. Of Kashmir, the Northeast and Sri Lanka, which one, I don't even know how you can gauge this, but is it a fair question to you if I ask you which one was the most challenging?
Well, of course it is, sir. You can... Sri Lanka.
Really?
Oh, sir. And I can say it with complete confidence. If you ask this with any of those who served in Sri Lanka and had the experience of serving in the Northeast and in J&K. And I served in J&K for a very long time. It broke my back, 3.5 years. They will still tell you it's Sri Lanka. For the simple reason, you went to a country where you didn't know the terrain. You didn't have the weaponry. You were fighting against a bunch of people, a guerrilla warfare, who could mix around with the civilians. It was a very difficult place. Your mindset, you were not tuned, you were not trained. And every infantry battalion that went in suffered casualties, very heavy casualties. My own unit, which is an SF unit, lost 3 officers killed, 5 captains wounded, 32 other ranks. When I joined, senior majors were going into operation. And everybody lost people. They shattered the myth of the martial races, the Gorkhas, the Sikhs, you name it. They would maul you. They were killers. See, the most dangerous fighter is the guy who's intelligent and motivated. And if he's trained and unleashed on a terrain of his own choosing, he's the most dangerous man. As the American Special Forces say, the right man in the right job is the most devastating weapon. And the Tamil Tiger was exactly that.
When you use this word motivated in terms of combat, what does that do to a human's mind? If you say that, okay, my mind is motivated, within combat, does that make you do riskier maneuvers, more dangerous moves? What is it?
Ranveer, if you're not motivated, you are going to hold yourself back in combat. Simple. And in Sri Lanka, everybody was raising this issue at some stage or the other. What are we doing here?
What are the Indian...
Why are we here? And there was this big talk that the RAW is supporting them. I hit a camp, and this is a known fact. I hit a camp where there were receipts of their casualties being treated in some clinic in Rameshwaram. There were movie tickets. They had their safe houses in South India. The RAW was supporting them. Everybody knew this double game happening. And at the same stage, you were getting mauled. So there were what you call radio patrols happening. The things that you see in the Vietnam.
What is the
very bit of, you sent a patrol, the patrol go out 200 meters from the perimeter, sit in the bush, fake some radio messages, come back. Why take a chance? So, it pushed the army to do these things. Because it was such a dangerous place, you stepped out of the post. And you didn't know you would come back in one piece. And I personally, I have the concentration of a butterfly. Very poor concentration and focus. Sri Lanka is the only place where I still remember, when you stepped out of the post, till you reached the ambush site, all your senses were working. All your senses were working. You couldn't let your guard down. They would hit you.
So could you give some geopolitical / political background on the situation? I'm assuming that this is about 93, 94, roughly that time. What was happening with this whole Tamil Tiger situation, and why were people even riled up in the first place? Because we have a lot of Gen Z listeners who were born after 2005.
No, they don't know a thing.
No.
So they don't know a thing. My second book was on Sri Lanka. From about early 80s, the Sinhala and the Tamils had been at loggerheads. The Tamil was always treated as a second-class citizen. Now, in a nutshell, there are Tamils who went in the last 100 years who were taken by the Brits for rubber plantations. There were Tamils who had been there from the Chola times. They were the old Tamils. Nevertheless, they were treated as second-class citizens, and there had been resistance from time to time. And at some stage, a whole bunch of these Tamil parties came up, EPRLF, LTTE, plot, etc., etc. Prabhakaran was the head of LTTE, and he was the most aggressive, pugnacious by nature. And at that stage, a whole bunch of these people under pressure of the genocide, sort of genocide being committed by the Sri Lankan forces, were coming into Tamil Nadu. And there was a fear in Tamil Nadu that there could be a voice to carve out a separate Elam, including parts of Tamil Nadu and stuff like that. So, and Tamil Nadu is a big state, and therefore it was decided at some stage that the Indians have to intervene. And instead of directly intervening, they decided to train the Tamils, arm the Tamils. And a whole bunch of them turned up for training in camps spread across Tamil Nadu. And one of them was at a place called Chakrata. This is up in the hills next to Dehradun.
Really, that far up?
Yes, and this is the interesting part, and I say this in my book also. The interesting part is my father was posted there. And that was his last posting.
In Chakrata?
In Chakrata. If I can
Sure.
digress a little more. Now, Chakrata has a base. It's called Establishment 22. It was set up in after the 62 war, funded by the CIA to train Tibetan guerrillas. These are people who had migrated, crossed the border and come into India. Mostly comes from eastern Tibet. So they
What
were
is
to be
that?
trained.
Like a tribe?
It's a Kham. It's
Okay.
Khampas, so the eastern Tibet area, fighters basically. So it was decided that the Americans would fund, the Indian army would train them, and they would be sent back for sabotage, spying, etc., back into Tibet. So it was a very hush-hush. It still is a very secretive place. They haven't developed Chakrata. It's at 7,000 feet. It's a nice hill station, but it's still a single road. And it's not by design. It's not by default. It's by design that the government doesn't allow anything to come up. And from time to time, that school, which was training Tibetans, was used for training all sorts of unsavory characters in the subcontinent. Sindhis, Baluchis, whoever needed to be trained could be sent there. One corner tucked up in the hills. And then at some stage, they started sending the Tamils. And the senior leadership of the LTT were trained there.
But who were the trainers?
Indian Army officers.
So this is an official...
Yeah.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is, I was about to join the army and I had come back from college. And my father was posted there. And I recall every weekend, because we were settling down in Dehradun. It's a 2-hour run. So every week, the school, Tutu establishment, the institute, would send the bus down to buy provisions at Dehradun, which was the nearest town. So my father would come across every weekend to stay the weekend. And I remember sitting there, and this bus drives up, curtains pulled, the driver wearing civilian clothes, but you can see the mark of a soldier on him. And my father steps out, and behind him, there's a South Indian guy carrying his suitcase. And this happened a couple of weekends. And I asked him, I said, who's this South Indian? He touched my father's feet. And I said, what is this? Oh, he says, oh, some canteen contractor, just grateful. And then he retired, he settled down, and, I got into the army at some stage. And then the India Today came out with some articles about the LTTE and the problem in Sri Lanka, and they're being trained in Chakrata, and there was a picture of Prabhakaran standing there with his cronies, the background of the hills. And my brother was also there. My brother looked at it and said, yeah, I've seen this guy. He's pointing at Prabhakaran. So I said, are you sure? Because they're writing about this guy now. He said, certain. Now, my brother claimed that Prabhakaran came there to the house. I don't know, but I certainly saw a whole bunch of these, and, in 88, 87, you didn't see too many South Indians in Dehradun up north. And you could see distinctly that they were different. So now look at this. The father trains them without realizing that the son will be facing his former students at some stage. And when I came back from Sri Lanka, I remember he was a very seasoned soldier. I came back from Sri Lanka, and I remember the first evening. He didn't ask me anything. In the evening, we sat down over a drink. And then he looked at me and he says, so, what do you think of the boys? I said, which boys? He said, my boys. I said, well, they were good. We lost a lot of men and officers. And I think I saw a little smile and a twinkle in the old colonel's eyes as he looked up. And then he raised a salute to the Tamil tigers of Sri Lanka. He said, serves you bastards right. Bullying with the boys, aren't you? He was very impressed with them. He says, some of them didn't even know how to tie a shoelace. And when we worked out an 8-hour training program, they said, no, the senior leader came up and said, no, make it 13, make it 14. That's the kind of motivation they had. And then you unleash them, train them, arm them, and unleash them on their own terrain. They were deadly.
Now I understand what you meant by motivated.
So that's one part. No? The other part is that, after they went back, and they took on the Sri Lankan army. And then at some stage, Jayawardene and Rajiv Gandhi signed this accord. It was supposed to be between 3 people, Prabhakaran, Jayawardene and Mr. Gandhi. Prabhakaran was holed up in Ashoka Hotel, I think, sort of a house arrest, guest. He was not consulted. They went and signed up. And he was told, fait accompli, here is the accord. He said, I have not even consulted, and I'm talking about an Elam, an independent state. I'm not interested in all this nonsense. I said, we don't care. We're sending the Indian peacekeeping force to ensure, because President Jayawardene said, look, we can't enforce disarming. We don't have the manpower. So we got embroiled. A whole bunch of us turned up there thinking it's going to be a peacekeeping mission. The Sri Lankan army was sent back into their barracks. We took over their post.
Which year was this?
It is 87. I joined later, of course, but the unit had been committed for some time. All 3 commando units were there. And till then, the LTTE used to come, sit in the mess and stuff like that, chat around. They'd been trained. Some of the instructors had trained them from the SF. All one army there.
What do you mean they came and sat in the mess?
Because we weren't taking them on. You see, for some time, the Indian Army, Maratha Battalion and a SF unit sitting at Palali Airfield. We're just sitting and watching what is happening while the accord was being signed. What sparked it off was that they captured 17 of these senior leaders, LTTE leaders, the Coast Guard. And at that stage, the accord had been signed. So Jayawardene said, hand them over to us, the Sri Lankan army. The LTTE said, don't do it. They'll be tortured, they'll be killed. But because the accord had been signed, it was decided to hand them over to the Sri Lankan army. At that stage, they asked that a last meal be given to the boys, and they passed cyanide capsules inside. And all 17 of them committed suicide, chewed on their cyanide capsules.
To prevent themselves from
from being taken over by the Sri Lankan army. And that was the spark. After that, the next, I think it was a 10-para, without taking any names here, it was one of their ration trucks which was going to Jaffna. Got the boys out, burned them, put tires around their neck. And then it was free for all. The enemy was Sri Lanka and the LTTE then.
They attacked Indian Special Forces.
And the infantry unit there. And then the force started building in. Because by then it was all right, if you're not going to listen to us and disarm, and your intent is clear, you're hostile, then we're going in. So then they started building in troop movement. And then they realized they needed more troops and more troops. And once we'd taken over the urban centers, the LTTE promptly disappeared into the jungle. Then it became jungle fighting. So most of my experience in Sri Lanka is just sitting in bloody ambush.
You mean in a jungle?
In a jungle. It was terrible. 72 hours, 96 hours, no bloody water. You're just sitting there. Some track coming in, going out in a very thick jungle. And you would go in at night, sit there, and just sit there.
So you guys would just wait for 72 hours continuously in the jungle and observe if there's any kind of movement or any kind of disturbance?
It was an ambush.
Okay.
It was an ambush operation.
For someone who doesn't understand that word, how do you explain
Well,
it?
you conceal yourself on some intelligence or at random because you feel there's movement, hostile movement, on a track.
On a track?
Track.
You mean like a road in the jungle?
Well, yes. And then you hope that the guy comes along so you can hit him.
And there's the danger of wild animals.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I ran to a few.
Really?
Yeah. I remember there was a Jat battalion and an elephant picked up the last guy and carried him in the bloody jungle.
And killed him?
No, threw him down. He was a little shaken, but he survived. I laid an ambush, I remember, and I think it was a 72-hour ambush. And the LMG guy suddenly nudged me. I was right next to him. We were covering a track. He nudged me and then did this. And in that starlight, through the foliage, I couldn't make out what he's showing. And then I saw some movement. I'd see that. I could see the foresight of the LMG, and I'd see something rise and fall and rise and fall. And then it was a wild boar. The guy was, I don't know, maybe he was bloody drunk on some fruit or something. He just walked up, sat himself, leaned against the LMG barrel, went off to sleep. And here the 20 hard SF men, shitting bricks. If this guy wakes up, and he's a Tusker, he wakes up and he charges, that's the end of your ambush, and that's the end. What do you do with a Tusker sitting there? And then he got up, shook himself, disappeared. And I felt very happy. I said, if this guy doesn't know we're sitting here, that means, because it takes time for the jungle smell to start coming.
What is that?
So you go, people often land up in ambushes. You can't go wearing aftershave, hair oil, talcum powder, and nonsense of that kind. So it takes some time before, generally 24 to 36 hours, before you start smelling like the jungle, which is essential. Because, people who you are after, the opposition is only living wild. Their sense of smell is very keen. The guy who's coming down that track, he can smell anything. So you got to be very careful that you are not using any artificial smell.
Which is why you said that Sri Lanka was the most challenging, because even those guys were as aggressive.
They were very aggressive. Their training films were some of these Hollywood movies.
Really?
They were aggressive. I mean, some of their operations were sheer madness.
What kind of weapons did they use?
They had AKs. They had better weapons than the Indian Army.
How?
Well, most of them were supplied by us. Then they got into their own procurement.
How?
Well, they had money.
How?
The entire Sri Lankan diaspora across the world was giving them money. The funding was being collected. So I came back on leave. This is a strange thing.
Is that the narrative, or could it have been geopolitical powers at play funding it?
No. This funding was happening. Their own people were funding them. People settled in Sweden, Norway, England. Forget that. I came on leave, and I remember at the Madras, now Chennai railway station, I had a bunch of these college guys asking me for donations. So I said, for what? He said, for the LTTE. And my first desire was to punch him in the face. And I said, I survived Sri Lanka. I get lynched by the locals in my own country. So they were collecting. They had enough money. They had their own ships, which were getting all the arms, equipment.
Thank you for watching this clip. If you want to learn more about this topic, we've curated a playlist just for you, and here's a link to the whole episode.